my entire adult life, I had lived in dark, rat-infested studio apartments in the worst parts of the city. I lived with a constant hope that someday I would be able to save up enough money to move out and buy myself a proper apartment in a nice, modern, high-rise building. But alas, with my low-paying job, that felt absolutely unreal. Then, one day, a good friend of mine called me and said he could help me out with a place. The very next day, we met up with Andrew and he introduced me to a local realtor. The realtor, in turn, immediately suggested I ride with him to check out my future palace. It was a newly built high-rise located almost completely outside the city limits. I was, of course, happy with everything. The price was ridiculously, almost suspiciously low for a place like this. It was a spacious one-bedroom apartment with all the modern amenities, a separate bathroom and toilet, nothing like the filthy holes I had rented in the past. During the daytime inspection, my eyes were literally glowing with excitement, and I immediately agreed to the purchase. In one short week, we settled all the paperwork, and I packed my bags ready to move into my new home. My joy simply knew no bounds. The entire long bus ride there that evening, I couldn't stop thinking, what is the catch? Various paranoid thoughts swarmed in my head, but pure joy quickly overcame all my logical doubts. When the city bus finally pulled up to my stop, it was already a late, dark evening, and oddly enough, I suddenly realized that I didn't see a single light on in any window of that entire massive building. I was the only passenger who stepped off at that deserted stop. Further down the route was just the end of the line. Approaching the main entrance, I started digging through my pockets looking for my intercom keys. It was incredibly dark outside because past my building there were absolutely no new developments. Just thick woods and a suburban housing tracks only started a couple of miles away. The only source of light was the flickering street lamp that shone only on the paved road. So right next to my building's entrance, it was pitch black. I struggled to find my new keys, tapped the magnet, and stepped into the lobby. Inside, there was a dead, deafening silence, and that exact same suffocating darkness. The smell of raw concrete and construction dust hung heavy in the air. But how is this possible? I thought to myself. When I came here with a realtor, I didn't pay attention to the lighting in the lobby. It was a bright day and I was too excited to think about it. There was nothing to do. I had to walk toward the elevators. My new apartment was on a 5th floor. There were 11 floors in the building total. And as you could probably guess, the elevator was, of course, out of order. The digital display above the closed doors was completely dead. I pulled out my phone and, using the flashlight to guide my way, began to slowly climb the concrete stairs. I suddenly realized that I hadn't paid attention to any other tenants at all when I inspected the place. Were all the newly moved in people really asleep already? It wasn't even 10 o'clock at night yet. My thoughts were shifting every single second, going from annoyance to deep anxiety. I was getting creeped out and I tried to walk very quietly, making almost no noise at all with my boots. The atmosphere in that cramped stairwell was deeply oppressive. I just wanted to get behind the locked door of my apartment as quickly as possible and turn on the lights. I climbed higher and higher, flight after flight, but my physical strength began to inexplicably drain away. My legs felt like lead and I could barely walk. Am I really so out of shape that I can't walk up to the 5th floor with one small duffel bag? I scolded myself. I looked at the clock on my phone. It was 1:20 in the morning. My heart dropped into my stomach. This can't be real, I thought in the panic. How long have I been walking up these damn stairs? I had stepped off the bus only 15 minutes ago. I began to speed up in a panic, hyperventilating and counting the floor numbers painted on the walls. 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 6th. The 5th floor simply did not exist. "What the hell is going on?" I whispered. I stopped abruptly and pressed my back against the cold concrete wall. My breathing was ragged, and in absolute dead silence, I could hear my own heart violently pounding. After catching my breath slightly, I heard something creak deep down below in the shaft. Then came a louder, clanking mechanical sound. It was the elevator. It had started slowly, methodically moving up the shaft. I didn't know what to think. Maybe it was one of the new residents returning from a late shift or a party. The elevator reached my floor and stopped with a heavy clank. I closed my eyes and began to pray desperately that the metal doors wouldn't open, but they slid apart with a hiss. I squeezed my eyes shut tightly. I didn't open my eyes for what felt like an eternity, waiting for someone to step out, but there were absolutely no sounds, no footsteps, no breathing. The elevator just stood on my floor with its doors wide open, and they weren't closing. "Pull yourself together," I screamed at myself mentally. I snapped my eyes open. The elevator cabin was completely empty. In pure animalistic terror, I bolted and sprinted up the stairs to the next floor. In that exact second, I heard the elevator doors slam shut. It began slowly rising higher, as if it was intentionally pursuing me. I ran up the stairs faster and faster, but my legs completely refused to obey me. I kept stumbling, falling to my knees, scraping my skin and crawling back up. And then I saw it. The door to the apartment, directly across from the stairwell, was cracked open. What was inside, I couldn't see. It was completely dark. Without thinking, I dashed inside. The door instantly slammed shut behind my back entirely on its own, making a loud clicking sound as it locked. I didn't pay much attention to it. I was still way too terrified of that cursed elevator outside. After calming down a bit and catching my breath, I walked over to the living room window and looked outside. There was nothing beyond the glass. Literally, it was solid pitch black darkness, as if someone had painted the outside of the window with thick black paint. There were no street lamps, no moon, no forest. In full panic, I ran to the kitchen and looked out the window there. But here too, outside the apartment, there was the exact same impenetrable blackness. Nothing existed out there. My God, what is happening to me? I thought in absolute horror. Am I losing my mind? Grabbing the first heavy object I could find, which turned out to be a metal light fixture, I screamed and hurled it directly at the window. The glass shattered into a million pieces. A blindingly bright, searing light burst into the room. I collapsed to the floor and lost consciousness. I woke up to the beeping of monitors in a brightly lit hospital room. It turned out that I had been in a deep coma for exactly 6 months following a horrific car crash. On that rainy evening, the driver of the city bus I was taking to my new apartment lost control on the slick road. The bus swerved into oncoming traffic and collided head-on with a massive 18-wheeler. No one survived that terrible accident. No one except me. All the time, I had been trapped in limbo. My mind had been wandering through the dark corridors between life and death. The police informed me that I was only 500 yards away from my stop when the impact happened. After a month of physical therapy, I was finally discharged from the hospital. I called my friend Andrew, and together we drove to that very same apartment on the outskirts. We wanted to finally celebrate my recovery and my long-awaited housewarming. We were sitting on a bus chatting. As we approached my new building, the sun began to set. It was getting dark. I cast a glance out the window at the approaching high-rise. My heart stopped. Not a single light was on in any apartment of that massive building. It was absolutely black and dead. A sickening feeling of déjà vu washed over me. I spun around to look at my friend, but the seat next to me was completely empty. I looked around the cabin. All the other passengers had vanished. There was no one in the moving bus except me. Cold shivers ran down my spine because I realized I never actually woke up. This happened back in the 1990s in a fading, gloomy industrial town in Maine. My parents had gone to work far away in Alaska to make a living, leaving me under the strict care of my grandmother in the cramped, gray apartment building on the bleak outskirts of the city. I had just transitioned into the second grade, making me around 7 years old, while the entire neighborhood crew of kids was at least 5 or 6 years older than me. Because of this massive age gap, and despite my grandmother's fierce prohibitions, I frequently sneaked away to play on the adjacent streets just to escape the loneliness. Pretty soon, I fell in with a rough crowd of older boys. I cannot say we were actual friends. I simply had no other choice, and I lacked the brains at that age to realize that they were merely using me for their own amusement. Their manipulation scheme was incredibly simple. They would constantly take me on a dare, proposing various bets and games that it was physically impossible for the 7-year-old to win. Afterwards, they would aggressively remind me that for a real man, a bet is a matter of absolute honor. I had to pay off these manufactured debts with my lunch money, candy, or rare comic books. They played their roles perfectly, keeping me in a perpetual state of artificial debt. I don't quite remember the exact day they lured me to the ruins of an old colonial stone mansion deep in the dense woods. We spent an hour exploring the crumbling, moss-covered brick walls and climbing through shattered foundations. The atmosphere among the dark trees was heavy, and the ruined structure looked like a decaying jaw rising from the earth. The ultimate test to clear my entire debt was laid out before me. I had to descend a narrow, crumbling flight of stone stairs leading down into the earth, open a heavy, rotten wooden door, and step into the absolute darkness of the subterranean cellar, pulling the door shut behind me. That was it. If I succeeded, my debt would be entirely forgiven, and no one would ever question my bravery again. But if I failed, my debt would instantly double. A couple of the older boys began to nudge me, whispering that it was a total piece of cake. I vividly remember catching a predatory, hungry look in their eyes at that moment. They knew exactly how much I was terrified of the dark, and they were savoring my fear. I slowly walked down the damp stone steps, my boots crunching on loose gravel. Inside my chest, a desperate hope lingered that the ancient door would be rusted shut, ending the nightmare right there. But as I reached out, the heavy iron bolt slid back with an effortless, oily click. I froze, holding my breath, listening intently to the void beyond. From the pitch-black space behind the wood, someone or something let out a soft, long sigh of pure anticipation. It was the kind of deep breath a person takes in the morning when they are looking forward to something wonderful from the brand new day. I spun around in panic. My so-called companions were standing at the top of the stairs, their faces twisted into ugly, mocking grins. A sudden burning urge flamed up inside me to smash those smirks off their faces. I turned back, pulled the iron handle, and threw the heavy door wide open. The floor past the threshold was entirely covered in a thick layer of fine white sand, which looked deeply unnatural for an underground cellar. Stepping over the threshold, I pulled the rotten door closed. The moment it touched the frame, it slammed shut with a deafening bang, and the heavy bolt slid into place from the outside. Instantly, a loud, mocking explosion of laughter erupted from the other side of the wood. I panicked, throwing my weight against the door, pounding my fist against the thick planks, weeping and begging them to let me out. From the outside, they just kept laughing, shouting through the cracks that I had to pay a massive monthly tribute in candy and give them half of my prized toy collection if I ever wanted to see the sun again. I was terrified enough to agree to all of their cruel demands, but before I could scream a response, a sudden wave of freezing, icy breath blasted against my bare neck from the depth of the cellar. A violent, uncontrollable shudder rang my entire body. As my eyes frantically adjusted to the absolute pitch-black darkness, I realized I wasn't alone. Deep in the shadows, on the white sand, a tall, monstrous silhouette began to manifest. It was an impossible creature, grotesquely elongated, with thin, multi-jointed limbs and two large, milky white hollow eyes that shifted rhythmically in the dark, staring directly into my soul. Pure, suffocating horror paralyzed me. My legs gave out and I collapsed onto my knees, burying my face against the rough wood of the door. The dark cellar felt like a trap closing in, and I felt as though the door was made of the cardboard, wishing I could just smash my head right through it to escape, but I had absolutely no physical strength left to stand up. I just sat there in the white sand, feebly thumping my skull against the boards. Suddenly, something incredibly sharp and cold dragged slowly down my spine. The sound of my heavy jacket fabric ripping apart echoed like a thunderclap in the confined space, leaving a freezing, slimy trail against my skin. A set of rough, leathery fingers crept up toward my throat. They wrapped around my neck, squeezing with agonizing force. From the outside, one of the boys shouted a question, asking what I was doing. I desperately tried to scream that I would give them everything I owned, but the entity's grip was so tight that only a pathetic, choked whimper escaped my lips. And just as the darkness was about to completely swallow my consciousness, the outside lock suddenly clicked. The door flew open and I tumbled backward out onto the stone steps, sobbing hysterically. My older boys stood over me, pointing and roaring with laughter at my tears. I don't remember exactly what cruel words they hurled at me, but that was the exact moment I experienced a blinding, consuming hatred for the first time in my life. I wanted those three bullies to burn alive. I wiped the tears from my eyes, stood up, and looked them dead in the face. I told them that I would give them all my comic books, my entire toy collection, and my grandfather's prized vintage military binoculars if they had the guts to step into the cellar themselves and prove it was empty. Their arrogant expressions shifted into greedy smirks. One of them spat on the ground and said, "Watch this, you little punk. We'll show you there is nothing to be scared of." The three of them stepped over the threshold onto the white sand. The heavy wooden door creaked on its rusty hinges and slowly swung shut behind them with a soft click. I stood on the stone steps, my heart racing, waiting for them to start pounding on the wood or laughing. But what followed was an immediate muffled shriek of absolute blood-curdling regret from inside the cellar. It was cut off instantly, followed by a wet, heavy thud. Then, a dead, eternal silence enveloped the ruins. I stood there for a long time as the sun went down, but not a single sound ever came from behind the door again. When darkness completely covered the woods, I calmly turned around and walked home. In a little girl's bedroom, there was an old wardrobe that had a large mirror attached to the inside of the door. This girl was a fan of tickling her own nerves before bed, so sometimes she would open this wardrobe in the dead of the night and look at her reflection in the dark. One time when she got bored, she did it again. She was surprised by an interesting and creepy effect that appeared this time. Thanks to a strange play of moonlight and shadow, her reflection in the mirror appeared to have empty, black eye sockets and a huge, unnaturally wide mouth. The reflection looked very realistic, almost three-dimensional, and mimicked her movements. After admiring this creepy sight for a minute, the girl closed the door and went to the bathroom. But on the way, she remembered something, and it made her instantly turn on the bright light in the bathroom, lock herself inside, and wake up her parents and half the neighbors with her hysterical scream. The thing was, during rearranging the day before, her father had removed and taken the mirror out of the wardrobe. This story didn't happen to me, but when it was told to me, I didn't doubt its truth for a second. In the summer of 2009, I went to visit my grandmother in the remote mountain town in Appalachia, West Virginia. The kind of place where cell service dies and everyone knows everyone's business. There, through a lucky coincidence, I met a great local girl named Chloe. Chloe had an older brother named Luke. He was built like a brick outhouse, a real mountain man. At first, he glared at me like a wolf, and there were even a few threats, but eventually, we found common ground. Luke turned out to be a normal guy, and one fine day, we agreed to go fishing together at the local lake. The sun was beating down relentlessly. The fish were biting reluctantly, and the mosquitoes were eating us alive. Thank God Luke brought along a cure for the sweltering boredom. A large mason jar of strong homemade local moonshine. We quickly finished it off, the liquid burning our throats. After that, we kind of stopped caring about the fish, and we started chatting about everything. Suddenly, Luke became very serious. His gaze darkened, and he told me a story that happened to him before he ever met me. Luke had a childhood friend named Tommy. The two of them were inseparable back in the day. They often visited abandoned forest cabins miles off the main road, looking for old coins, antique bottles, or copper wire to scrap for cash. One dead of night, fueled by boredom and cheap beer, they decided to explore an old, rotting, uninhabited house that was located deep in the woods. They approached the house and pulled the front door. It was locked. They walked around the house and saw a window that had been ripped out along with its frame. The guys climbed inside through it. Inside the house, the air was thick with dust and the smell of rot. Everything was turned upside down. Dirty, mildewed sheets were scattered across the floor. A rusted iron bed was flipped over, and the heavy wooden table was broken in half. While they were sifting through the trash in the pale beams of their flashlights, they suddenly started hearing some noise from outside. At first, they thought it was a wild dog or a coyote, but they still decided to lay low and turn off the lights. Luke told me that for some reason, at that exact moment, a chilling fear pierced his soul. The noise outside wouldn't stop. In the absolute suffocating silence of the Appalachian night, you could clearly hear thick, dry branches snapping loudly under someone's feet. And suddenly, it dawned on Luke. A dog or a coyote cannot be that heavy. Whatever was walking outside was massive, and it was walking on two legs. The footsteps were slow, heavy, and deliberate, pacing back and forth in front of the porch. At that very moment, Luke became truly terrified. His mouth went completely dry, and his heart started hammering against his ribs. Then Luke noticed his friend, Tommy was standing motionless, staring at a single spot, and his face was completely contorted with unspeakable terror. Luke slowly turned his head at the exact same spot. He froze, staring right at them through the empty, shattered window with the massive god's face. It wasn't just an animal. It was too high off the ground, hunched over broad humanoid shoulders. Its face was pale, covered in filthy, matted fur that reeked of copper and wet earth. But the worst part was the eyes. Human eyes, but with horizontal pupils gleaming with a sickly, intelligent malice. Running out of the house was terrifying because that thing was standing right outside the only exit. They just stood frozen in the dark, trapped, not knowing what to do. Suddenly, the god's face slowly lowered down and disappeared into the shadows. Dead silence fell over the woods. Tommy and Luke continued to stand like statues, afraid to even breathe. About 5 minutes passed. Nothing happened. They nervously started to think that everything was fine and the creature had left. But suddenly, from outside, right next to the closed front door, someone yelled. It was a macabre, distorted voice. It sounded like a vocal cord trying to mimic a human, but it was pitched wrong, vibrating in a demonic register.
Open the door, or it's going to be worse.
Right after those words, something started slamming into the old wooden door. The blows were of such inhuman, explosive strength that the entire cabin shook, dust falling from the ceiling. Tommy went into full hysterics. He dropped his flashlight and started sobbing uncontrollably, covering his ears. After about the third massive blow, the rusted lock gave out. The door violently smashed wide open. Luke didn't wait for that thing to step into the room. Beside himself with primal fear, he sprinted toward the broken window. He vaulted through the splintered frame and landed hard on the muddy ground outside. And in that exact second, he heard a heart-rending, agonizing scream from Tommy echoing out of the pitch-black cabin. A wet, tearing sound followed. At this point of the story, Luke's voice cracked and his hands were shaking so badly he had to put his drink down. I swear tears welled up in his eyes. Luke ran. How he made it home through the dense pitch-black woods, he couldn't remember himself. Branches whipped his face, tearing his skin, but he didn't stop once. He lay in his bed the entire night, paralyzed, without closing his eyes. Morning finally came. Someone knocked aggressively on Luke's door. It was Tommy's mother. She was in panic. She said that her son came home near dawn, barely alive. His hair, which had been dark brown the day before, had turned completely stark white. When asked what happened, he just mumbled incoherently, stared at his hands, and shook violently. She looked Luke dead in the eyes and asked the question, "Do you know what happened to him out there?" And Luke lied. He swallowed his guilt, said he had no idea, and claimed he had basically sat at home alone all night. From that very day, Tommy completely withdrew into his own mind. He stopped talking, stopped eating, and stopped communicating with anyone, including his own mother. He just stared blankly at the wall, rocking back and forth. A week later, he was taken to the psychiatric asylum, and they keep him there to this day, heavily medicated in the locked ward. The only person in the world besides me that Luke ever dared to tell this story to was his sister Chloe. And thank God she was one of those rare girls who knows how to keep a dark secret. I was the second, and most likely the absolute last person Luke told this horrific truth to, because exactly 2 weeks after our conversation on that lake, Luke died in a horrific fatal motorcycle crash on an empty night highway. They say he swerved off the cliff like he was trying to avoid something standing in the middle of the road. Why he told this story specifically to me, a city guy he had only known for a couple of weeks, I don't know. Probably it was just eating away at his soul. The guilt was gnawing him alive from the inside. He needed to confess it to someone, because if he told his local friends, they would have killed him for abandoning Tommy in that cabin, and the whole town would panic knowing what roams in their woods. Luke knew I was leaving soon and wouldn't tell anyone. To believe in the God-man or not to believe, that is a personal choice for everyone. But looking into Luke's haunted eyes that day, I believed it all. I was always deeply drawn to anatomy, and I genuinely wanted to be useful to sick people. Therefore, I enrolled in a prestigious medical school in Boston, Massachusetts. This chilling incident happened during my first year of studies, back in the 90s. As medical students, we regularly had practical classes in the university's old underground morgue. We participated in autopsies, practiced dissection, and assisted the senior doctors. On one of those long, exhausting days, toward the late evening, our practical classes finally came to an end. The professor left, and all the students, as usual, headed to the locker room showers attached to the morgue to wash off the heavy, clinging stench of formaldehyde. That evening, I stayed behind a little late. I was putting away my instruments and went to the showers when the rest of the students had already left. I spent about 15 minutes getting cleaned up, changed into my everyday clothes, and headed for the exit. To get to the main stairwell, my path required me to walk back through the large dissection hall. It was a long, freezing room where sheet-covered cadavers lay on the metal tables prepared for tomorrow's examinations. I quickly walked past the silent bodies, trying not to look at them. I reached the heavy metal door leading to the main corridor and pushed down on the handle. It didn't budge. I yanked it harder, but it was locked from the outside. The security guard must have assumed the basement was completely empty and locked everything down for the night. For some time, I aggressively tortured the door handle. Then I started knocking loudly and kicking the heavy metal with my boots. But the old door didn't even flinch. Time passed, and it was getting very late. I pressed my ear against the cold steel, but there were absolutely no sounds, footsteps, or signs of human presence outside. I didn't have a cell phone to call for help, especially since it was the 90s. Panic began to creep into my mind. How could they forget about me? I started screaming, hoping someone on the upper floors would hear me. After losing my voice, I finally realized with horror that there were no living people left in the building, just me and these covered bodies. I tried to calm myself down, deciding I would just have to endure this night and wait for the morning shift. But suddenly, with loud electric click, the industrial fluorescent lights on the ceiling shut off. The building's automatic timer had triggered. The massive hall was plunged into pitch-black darkness. The only source of light now was the faint, eerie greenish glow from the emergency exit sign above the locked door. The thick darkness made the freezing hall feel absolutely suffocating. Finally, accepting my fate, I huddled into the far corner of the room, pulling my knees tightly to my chest. I closed my eyes, deciding to simply kill time by sleeping. The morgue was unnaturally quiet. I had just begun to doze off when the faint sound sliced through the silence. I tensed up, my eyes snapping open in the dark. It sounded like a soft rustle of fabric. I stared into the gloom, my heart racing, but I couldn't see anything moving. I took a deep breath, and began to rationalize the fear away. It's just an old building settling, I told myself. It's a ventilation system, or just my sleep-deprived brain playing cruel tricks on me. I waited in tense silence for another 5 minutes. When nothing else happened, the heavy blanket of exhaustion finally took over. I convinced myself it was just a hallucination, rested my head on my knees, and slowly drifted back into a light, uneasy sleep. But I wasn't asleep for long. A sudden, much louder noise jolted me awake. This time, there was absolutely no denying it. It wasn't the building, and it wasn't the wind. It was the distinct sound of heavy plastic sliding against the wet metal. It came directly from one of the autopsy tables in the center of the room. My breathing completely stopped. I peered into the green-lit gloom, my heart beating so hard my ribs physically ached. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I noticed movement. The thick white sheet covering one of the bodies slowly, jerkily slid off the edge and fell onto the floor. I covered my mouth with both hands to keep from screaming out loud. The silhouette of a grown man was slowly sitting up on the stainless steel table. His movements were incredibly stiff and mechanical, as if he was fighting through deep rigor mortis. There was a sickening, wet crunch of popping joints in the silent room. Then, the corpse slowly swung its rigid legs over the edge of the table and slid down. Its bare, dead feet touched the cold tiled floor with a heavy, wet slap. He stood there for a few seconds, swaying slightly, trying to find his balance. And then, the absolute most terrifying thing I could have ever imagined happened. Out of all the vast, dark space in that massive hole, he noticed me cowering in the corner. He slowly turned his head directly toward me. What I saw in the faint, sickly green emergency light was permanently burned into my brain. He had no eyes, just black, gaping eye sockets staring directly into my soul. His pale, stiff jaw was moving up and down, opening and closing silently, as if he was trying to say something to me from beyond the grave. An animalistic, paralyzing fear pinned me entirely to the wall. I blinked hard, praying desperately that it was just a severe sleep paralysis, a horrific, vivid nightmare that I would wake up from. But when I opened my tear-filled eyes, the creature took its first, clumsy, dragging step right toward me. He was walking, swinging his arms awkwardly, close in the distance. My survival instinct finally broke the paralyzing spell. I jumped to my feet, let out the loudest, most primal scream of my entire life, and bolted for the heavy metal door. I began pounding on it frantically with both fists, smashing my knuckles against the steel until they bled, sobbing wildly and begging for anyone to help me. I looked over my shoulder in pure panic. The corpse was only a few feet away from me now. Its long, gray, decaying arms were reaching out for my face. The empty eye sockets locked onto mine. Its ice-cold fingers were mere inches away from touching my skin. I squeezed my eyes shut tightly, crying, fully expecting the absolute end. And in that exact terrifying second, the heavy door behind my back crashed wide open. I fell backward into the brightly lit corridor, collapsing right into the arms of the startled night watchman. He had heard my desperate screaming during his routine patrol. The bright beam of his powerful flashlight cut deeply through the darkness of the anatomy lab. I looked back over his shoulder in absolute terror, but the hall was completely empty. There were no standing silhouettes. All of the dead bodies were lying peacefully on their steel tables, tightly and perfectly covered with their white plastic sheets. I spent the rest of the night in the security booth, shivering violently under the warm blanket and drinking liters of hot tea. When I hysterically told the old watchman what I saw, he didn't look surprised at all. He just nodded silently and smirked grimly, as if it wasn't the first time he had heard such a horrifying thing. Despite that living nightmare, I didn't quit medicine. I became a doctor, but since that night, I never, under any circumstances, stay alone in dark rooms.